Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi. In some of my videos about Jordan Peterson, I made reference to him talking about how to be happy, and a number of people have objected to this, saying that I probably used the word happy in my video about Jordan Peterson more times than he's ever used it in all of his videos put together, and things to this effect, which is a fair criticism. And I wanted to explain what I meant, because this does rest on something of a misunderstanding of what I meant, or, if you want to shift the blame on me not being clear about what I meant. Very reasonable position to take, that latter one. Anyhow, so there are several senses to the word happy. One of them is an emotional state, that bubbly, effervescent, things are pleasant now, smiling emotion. The emotional state of happiness is something that very much Jordan Peterson does not think is deeply important. This is because he is not a fool. Nobody who is not a fool thinks that the emotion of happiness is the point of human life, or deeply significant, or anything like that. It's obviously not. That's the emotion is, pleasant, but it's fleeting, it's effervescent, it comes at the wrong times, it's missing from things it should be there for, and so on. It's not very important. And anybody who has any real sense of the world and how to live well knows, obviously, that the emotion of happiness is nice and great, if you can get it, and it's a bonus on top of anything better. Okay, there's another sense of happiness, which you might call the ontological sense of happiness. Ontology referring to being. That is the state of fullness of being. And in this sense, happiness, which is not an emotion at all, but rather a state of being, is about, are you acting in the fullness of being a human being? So to, give something of an, just sort of counterexample for illustrative purposes, if you just sit around in your backyard all day, munching on grass, occasionally mooing, are you happy? No. Doesn't matter really how content you are at the moment, or how much you've forgotten about all your troubles, or what the people who are relying on you to do something will do without you having done it, etc. You are not happy in the ontological sense, because you are not a cow. You're a man, and you're a man who isn't doing what a man should be doing. And so living life as if you were a cow is living as a small fraction of what a human being should do. You're also eventually going to probably die of malnutrition if you're literally just munching on grass and nothing else, because you don't have the appropriate stomachs and so on to get much nutrients from grass, which is a great physical metaphor for the spiritual deficit that's going on in living like a cow. Now, obviously, very few people actually go to that extreme, but it is useful as an illustration for what living like less than a human being is. So, something that people actually do is, for example, just chasing tons and tons of what they will call sex, and I prefer to call team masturbation. That's team with an M. The thing where multiple people have a similar goal they are working towards. That pickup artists, for example, are known for doing this sort of thing, where they make their life entirely about in engaging in as much team masturbation as they can, with as many different people as possible. This is subhuman in the sense of a human being is meant to do much more than this. And so just chasing this around eventually leaves you feeling hollow and empty, and in an ontological sense, unhappy. It eventually leads to your misery, and unfortunately, probably your eventual suicide at some point. You've yet to see that, but if you don't repent from being a pickup artist, once you hit your 60s and your 70s, you're going to be friggin' miserable. Anyway, especially, you're also going to have the idea that, you've gotten as much out of life as possible, now it's time to die with dignity. So I don't mean necessarily, shooting yourself. You might, enlist a doctor's aid for the suicide, which somehow makes it, so much better than shooting yourself in a uglier killing yourself in an uglier manner. It's really the same thing. And so, I mean, pray for pickup artists, please, because they really seem to need it. Anyway, that's an example, by contrast, of what a lack of happiness in that ontological sense comes from. You can see this. It really becomes very clear in the Christian tradition what's meant by happiness in this ontological sense, in the interesting Greek word makarios, which gets translated either as happy or blessed. Blessed, by the way, of the past tense of to bless, as in you have been blessed. You have received a blessing. And so you see this here, that it is, because of course in the Christian sense, a human being is a contingent being and therefore needs to have their contingency filled by some actuality. The only actuality really on offer, though possibly with intermediate conduits, is God. And so to be happy in this sense is the same thing as to be blessed. It is to be filled with God, because you are contingent and need that contingency actualized by something which is actual. That's the sense in which I was referring to Jordan Peterson and happiness, and how Jordan Peterson thinks that you're supposed to be happy. Not in the emotional sense, which would be stupid and obviously contrary to what he said, because he's not a fool, but rather in the fullness of being sense. Now, I suspect he often, and this ties into some of the things I said, in my video about what should a Christian make of him, or Jordan Peterson versus Jung, I suspect he is still agnostic as to whether or not it is possible to actually achieve this, to become fully actualized. But very clearly it is possible to be massively under-actualized in your potentiality, and to remain all potentiality. In fact, he talks about this in one video. I forget whether it was about Pinocchio or not, but he mentioned that to remain nothing but no, I'm sorry, it was about Peter Pan, and why was Peter Pan so awful in a sense, awful in the sense of awe, not like a bad story, but like, why is this such a pitiable state? That he is pure potentiality with no actualization, and pure potential, though it's intriguing, is nothing. Hasn't done anything yet, doesn't consist of anything. And so he talked about like the importance of actually making choices and foreclosing most of your possibilities, but actually becoming something. So you can see right there, when he's talking about how the worst possible state is one of pure potentiality with no actualization, I'm kind of using the Aristotelian terms, that is the worst state to be in. And so you need, to have any chance of happiness at all, the one that that will involve plenty of emotional unhappiness and plenty of suffering, which is the antithesis of emotional happiness, but not necessarily the antithesis of ontological happiness. In point of fact, and this is within the Christian tradition, probably something that Jordan Peterson himself respects a lot. I just haven't seen all his videos. Is that Christ is Christ. Was fully in communion with God, was fully actualized within the Christian understanding. And on the cross, Christ was at the furthest extremes from power, he was nailed down, he couldn't move, from pleasure, he was scourged and crucified, it was one of the most painful ways to die. Power, pleasure, wealth, he was naked on a cross, he had literally nothing. He had absolutely nothing of any kind. You might possibly describe him as being in possession of the crown of thorns, but woohoo. And finally, honor. Well, crucifixion was the most dishonorable way to die that the Romans could come up with. It's not saying that they were that no one ever came up with anything worse anywhere throughout history, but at least that was the best the Romans could come up with, was crucifixion, the worst possible way they could have to die. It was the most, being publicly naked, nailed, and suffering for all to see was the most dishonorable thing they could come up with. So Christ was at the furthest extremes possible from power, pleasure, wealth, and honor, and yet, being fully actualized, despite being at the most extremes of suffering, he was also the happiest man alive, in that ontological sense. So, in which happiness and suffering are not at odds with each other at all. And so I believe that's one of the many things that Jordan Peterson finds very attractive in Christianity. It's understanding that happiness in an ontological sense is not at all at odds with suffering in an emotional sense. So, basically, I hope that clarifies the point, that I was not in any sense trying to call Jordan Peterson the sort of fool who would talk about emotional happiness as being the highest good, but rather ontological happiness. Because there is an alternative. You can be purely negative, where you do nothing but try to avoid suffering. And that's a very distinct thing from looking for that ontological happiness in the sense of makarios, in the sense of fullness of life, or having life and having it to the full, as someone once said. So that's the distinction I was really trying to draw. I tend to forget even about the happiness in the emotional bubble sense, because it's foolish to chase after that, and I just don't. I don't even normally talk to the sort of people who think about that too much. So I forgot to even clarify that what I was really talking about was the distinction between looking for the fullness of actualizing potentiality, the fullness of being, versus merely trying to avoid suffering. And that's the distinction. That was something of a live question, which I believe is answered. It's a live question if you don't know much of anything of what Jordan Peterson said and only heard a few snippets, and I think is a question that is answered when you hear more of him. That he comes down in favor of the actualization of potentiality, of being happy in that sense of fullness of being, as opposed to simply trying to avoid suffering, and to minimize that, which is effectively a minimization of being. It becomes a little bit silly because it's only a question for people who are who are held back by fear from killing themselves in the position of believing that they, that is to say, within the mindset of trying to avoid suffering, if that is literally the only thing, if there's no good you can pursue, you can only avoid evil, then obviously the thing to do is to kill yourself as soon as possible, because that will minimize the evil, but maybe you're too scared to do it. And so when I say too scared, I mean within that framework of holding suicide to be the highest good, then the only thing that could hold you back would be fear. It's obviously wrong. Not committing suicide is in fact what people should do because, well, God loves you, and it's possible to, actualize your potential, fulfill your, to be filled with being, and so on. Life is good. It is not fear, but rather a love of life that should keep you from suicide. Fear will do it until you can do it for better reasons. Don't kill yourself. But there are much better reasons to not kill yourself. And so, having clarified that, okay, I hope this makes what I said about happiness and Jordan Peterson clearer here. I was not trying to impute anything foolish to him. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.